Okay, so welcome to part 3 of Meet and Greet the Exegetes. Today we're going to be looking at Ibn Ezra. We left off, here, and I'll post one more time because Savitz just got here. So there's in the chat box, Bob, is the link to the doc that has the source sheet because I failed to attach it to the email. So last class we ended off with the Rashbam. And I want to start with that Rashbam because in order to really appreciate what Ibn Ezra is going to do, we have to just understand. I want to start with Ibn Ezra's response to the Rashbam. So Ibn Ezra, if you recall, I guess we'll go back. Rashbam, we saw in many different places where Rashbam felt that you could divorce say it like this, there were multiple layers to the Torah. There's the traditional approach, and the traditional approach has what to say for tradition about various narrative events. But there's also a pshat. There's also what the text actually says, and those are different things. And so when it comes to a narrative piece, we have what the text actually says happens, and what the rabbis say actually happens. And that was not that big of a deal, but the more profound, the more significant thing of Rashbam was that he felt that was also the case when it came to legal texts. The Torah could say, bind it on your arm and put it between your eyes, and the rabbis will say, oh, well, that means tefillin. That means tying the black box on your arm, putting the black box on your forehead. That's what the Torah is talking about. That's what the rabbis say. And Rashbam said, not so fast. That might be what the rabbis say, but that's not what the Torah is actually saying. The Torah is saying you should always remember the Torah and mitzvot, and the rabbis said you should put tefillin on. And Rashbam was totally comfortable with that distinction. And the last piece that we had was Rashbam, and this sort of Michael was really, I think, fleshing it out nicely, the position of Rashbam. But the Rashbam said, the Torah describes day and night and describes the creation of the world as though, Rashbam says, the day starts in the morning. Rashbam says that's how creation happened. It was evening, it was morning. Okay, now it's morning, now start day 2. Evening, morning, now start day 3. And Rashbam said, according to the Torah, the day starts in the morning. It starts at first rays of sunlight, or maybe it starts at sunrise. But either way, it starts in the a.m. And that was what Rashbam said. And with that background, I want to jump right into Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra lived sometime during and after the life of the Rashbam. What made him unique, I think, among the commentators that we've seen and will see, is that Ibn Ezra did not write at all on the Talmud. Rashi, Rashbam, Ramban, who we're going to look at next week, wrote a lot of commentary on the Talmud. Ibn Ezra didn't. Ibn Ezra is known exclusively as a biblical commentator, philosopher, poet, but not a Talmudist, which is sort of interesting, which will come up in next week when we look at how Ramban didn't like Ibn Ezra, but he was a Bible guy, exclusively. That was his thing, Bible. Lived all over Spain, England. This letter that we're going to read, first source, is written in England. And I want to just jump right into this letter, and we'll see what Ibn Ezra thought of this opinion of Rashbam about the fact that the day starts in the morning, not the night. So it's all in English. It's written in very, very flowery, beautiful, poetic Hebrew, but it would have just taken us too long to work through both, so I just put the whole thing up in English here. Will someone read for us the first source? It's all English. It's long, but it's simple English.
I'll do it.
Okay.
It was mid-Friday night, the 14th day of the month of Tevet, in the year 4919. I, Abraham the Spaniard, known as Ibn Ezra, was in one of the cities of the island that is called Edge of the Earth, which is in the 7th zone of the inhabited zones of the earth. I was asleep, and my sleep was sweet to me. I dreamt that what appeared to be a man stood before me with a sealed letter in his hand. He spoke up and said to me, "Take this letter that the Sabbath sends you." I prostrated myself and bowed before God, and I blessed the God who gave us the Sabbath for honoring me so. I took hold of the letter with both my hands, and my hands dripped with myrrh. I read the letter, and it was sweet as honey to my mouth. However, as I read the last lines, my heart became agitated, and my soul almost failed me. I asked the one who stood before me, what is my iniquity and what is my sin? From the day that I knew the revered God who created me, I learned his commandments. I have always loved the Sabbath. I would go out to greet her with a full heart even before she arrived, and I would send her forth when she departed with joy and song. Who among her servants is as faithful as I? Why did she send me this letter? It read as follows.
Right, so just to back, so he's on the edge of the earth. He's in as far west in Europe that he knows, the known world. He's in England, and it's a Friday night, and he has this dream. And in this dream, an angel comes, gives him a letter. Here is a letter written to you by Shabbat. And Ibn Ezra started out saying, this is a really wonderful, lovely letter. And then I was horrified to read what it said. What did I do that was so upsetting to the Sabbath? So here's the letter. You got it's a very dramatic reading, Mark. Keep it up with the drama there.
I am Sabbath, the crowned law for the dear ones, fourth of the Decalogue. I am a sign of an eternal covenant between God and his children. With me, the Lord concluded all of his tasks, as it is written in the first of the books. Manna did not fall on the Sabbath day in order that I serve as a sign for her bearers. I am a joy for those living on earth and tranquility for those who dwell in graves. I am a pleasure for both male and female, old and young rejoice in me. Mourners do not mourn in me, nor eulogize the death of the righteous. Male servant and maid servant find quiet in me, and the strangers who are within the gates. All domesticated animals rest as horses, donkeys, and oxen. Every intelligent person sanctifies me over wine. The lowly perform the Havdalah service, as do Nazarites. Gates of understanding exist on any day, but on my day, 100 gates are open. My day is honored by not traveling, seeking one's needs, nor speaking words. I protected you all the days so that you would carefully observe me from the days of your youth. In your old age, a fault has been found in you, for books were brought into your house in which it is written to profane the seventh night. How do you remain silent and not vow to compile letters of truth and send them in all directions?
All right, so apparently books came to his house the previous night, and in those books it says how you have to profane the seventh night. Keep going.
Okay, the messenger of the Sabbath responded and said to me, the messenger of the Sabbath, she was told that yesterday your students brought books of biblical exegesis into your house in which is written to violate the Sabbath. Therefore, gird yourself on behalf of the Sabbath's honor to fight the Torah's battle with Sabbath's enemies. Do not favor any person. I woke with my spirit pounding within me and my soul very troubled. I arose and my anger burned within me. I dressed, washed my hands, and took the books outside to the moonlight. There was written the following interpretation for the verse. There was evening and there was morning. With dawn of the second day, one full day ended, for nighttime follows daytime.
And this is what we saw from Rashbam. This is a book of biblical exegesis that Rashbam had written in it, that the Jewish day, when it says the creation, that the day started in the morning. So he's calling out, not by name of the Rashbam, but he's referring to the position of the Rashbam. Just to go back a step, the not nor speaking words. So all of this, if you look at the original Hebrew, is very poetic, and in a good edition of Igeret HaShabbat, the letter of Shabbat that's published, it's footnoted all over the place with references all over the place. So here it's a reference to the concept of daber davar, that literally it's speaking words, but what it means is speaking words of business, speaking words of work. But that's what he's alluding to. But he's quoting, speaking words, quoting from the Bible and the Nevi'im when they talk about keeping Shabbat by being careful with how one speaks about work or not speaking about work. So that's what he's referring to there. But either way, the biblical exegesis doesn't explicitly say Rashbam, but as far as we know, probably Rashbam. Let's keep going to finish the last two paragraphs.
I almost tore my garment, and also that commentary saying, it is better to violate one Sabbath so that Israel will not violate many Sabbaths, if they should see this evil interpretation. we would also be a mockery and a scorn in the eyes of the uncircumcised. However, due to the honor of the Sabbath, I restrained myself. I vowed that I would not allow sleep from my eyes after the conclusion of the holy day until I wrote a lengthy letter explaining when the Torah's day begins, thereby removing a stumbling block, a snare, and a trap. For all of Israel, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Karaites, know that the only reason for writing the portion of creation relating God's actions each day is so that adherents of the Torah will know how to observe the Sabbath. They should rest as revered God rested, counting the days of the week. Now, if the sixth day ended with the morning of the seventh day, we should observe the following night. This interpretation will mislead all of Israel, those in the east and those in the west, those near and those far, both the living and the dead. God should avenge the Sabbath from one who believes this disturbing interpretation. The tongue of one who reads it aloud should cleave to his palate. Also, the arm of the scribe who writes this commentary to Scripture should wither and his right eye weaken.
In other words, here, I'll put it one more time there for you. In other words, Rashbam is a problem. He's saying the implication of Rashbam, if you were to take it to the fullest extent, that would mean that we're all keeping Shabbat incorrectly. Friday night is not Shabbat, and Saturday night is Shabbat. And so Ibn Ezra says this is a major, major problem, and it needs to be corrected. Thoughts? Michael, who defended the Rashbam so strongly last week, what do you have in respect?
I don't disagree that the Rashbam is liable to misunderstanding. I mean, he's saying that this interpretation will mislead all of Israel. I think that's a plausible argument. I don't know that I agree with it, but it's a plausible argument to say, the subtlety of saying that the text can have multiple meanings and that the pshat is not the same as the halacha, like, that's intellectually coherent, I think, but that doesn't mean that people can't take it the wrong way. And I mean, you mentioned to me after class last week that part of the context here is the whole Karaite controversy, which I'm assuming we'll be talking about. But the notion that people will misinterpret this and it will cause harm is not inconsistent with saying, yeah, but Rashbam still knows the pshat. Like those two things can both be true.
Fair. Yeah. So we'll see. In the introduction, Ibn Ezra writes a massive introduction where I only took highlights of it, but we'll see that he explicitly calls out he's living in a time and in a place where the number one threat to traditional Judaism were the Karaites, who were rejecting rabbinic Judaism in its entirety. And so on some level, and Ibn Ezra says this explicitly, that because of that, and because he feels a need to defend and substantiate the rabbinic interpretation, because he is a believer in the rabbinic interpretation, he feels a need to give them no ground at all to stand on, and to say that the halacha always reflects what the Torah actually says, or the Torah actually says whatever the halacha is. So that's definitely part of, and we're going to see that inside. Any other thoughts before we jump into Ibn Ezra's introduction to the Torah, where he'll lay out what he believes are 5 different approaches that one may have when interpreting the Torah, and how 4 of those 5 are all wrong, and of course the 5th one is the sole correct one. Yeah.
Why is there not a harmonizing kind of thing? It says that they're talking about 2 different things. The Rashbam is talking just about, counting the days, and it doesn't really have to do with observing the Sabbath.
Well, so I think in the last paragraph there, he says that, like, we all agree that the whole reason for Sefer Bereshit, or at least Parshat Bereshit, the whole reason we have the creation story at all is to give us a way to says, for all of Israel, both Pharisees and Sadducees, Karaites, know that the only reason for the writing of the portion of creation relating God's actions each day is so that adherents of the Torah will know how to observe the Sabbath. Like they're linked. The only reason it's here is for us to know how to keep Shabbat. So how the day's work there is going to inform how we keep Shabbat, because there's no other function that has. It's not teaching some deep, and this maybe we'll come to this in the next source, but it's not teaching some deep philosophic notion to totally be anachronistic and to skip forward to Rabbi Soloveitchik, who believes that the first 2 chapters of Genesis teach these deep philosophic truths about the nature of humanity. He says that's not at all what it's there so that we know how to keep Shabbat. That's the only reason that the Torah starts with the creation of the world. It's not giving us a history lesson. Maybe that could be a side conversation. It's not giving us history of evolution or biology or the Big Bang. It's not talking about any of the science. It's not talking philosophy. It's not teaching physics. It's teaching us when we keep Shabbat. And so that when we get the 10 Commandments and they tell us to rest on the 7th day because God rested on the 7th day, okay, that's so we keep Shabbat. Like, it's simple as that. It's not doing anything other than explaining the mitzvah of Shabbat. That's how Ibn Ezra sees it. You could also, you could definitely, one could easily disagree with this premise of Ibn Ezra if you were to just make an argument, either like Michael Weiss is saying, that it's not necessarily the case that the text needs to mean that the halachic day starts in the morning, or you could make the argument that it doesn't have any bearing on Shabbat. Like, maybe Ibn Ezra is incorrect. But maybe the reason that the Torah starts with Bereshit is to teach philosophy, or is to teach science, or is to teach physics, or whatever it is. And then his whole point of saying, well, it has to be consistent with how we keep Shabbat, it falls away because it's not really talking about that. So any other thoughts on this before we jump into Ibn Ezra's introduction? Okay, so source number 2 is Ibn Ezra's introduction to the Torah. So the letter, the Shabbat letter, the Sabbath letter in the first source already exists in many places in translation. The introduction to the Torah I couldn't find in any translation. When I was in college, I remember I had a friend of mine who took a class on translations. And I thought it was a funny class. Didn't really understand why you'd spend a whole semester in college talking about translations. But then over time, when translating text, I realized that there's a lot of science and wisdom to how you translate things. I did not take that class, so I am not a very strong translator. The Hebrew is beautiful and poetic and rhymes. And my English translation is not beautiful or poetic or rhyming. And I did my best to just translate in accordance with how I understood what Ibn Ezra was saying. So if you have a challenge on the translation, by all means raise the challenge, but I will acknowledge right now that it's not going to be a perfectly beautiful poetic translation. So that's my introduction to his introduction. So his introduction, he has, as I said before, he believes there are 5. He says the first line, Ne'um Avraham Asfaradi Nizkar Mefarshei Torah Hochim Al Chamisha Drachim. There are 5 ways that people understand the Torah. And spoiler alert, 4 of them are wrong, 1 of them is correct. And guess who is the one who has the correct interpretation? Ibn Ezra. Everyone else is wrong. And he has he uses a very visual image to depict how close all these different interpretations are to what he believes is the truth. So we'll jump right in to the first way in the first paragraph here. Someone want to read for us the first paragraph after the 5 ways of understanding the Torah. The first way is long and wide, that one.
I can read it if nobody else wants to.
All right, go ahead.
The first way is long and wide, used by many of our generation. And if the truth is like a dot in a circle, this is a wide line that goes around the dot. This is the way that many great ones went. They are the sages of the schools in among the Ishmaelites, like Rav Yitzchak, who wrote 2 books on the first chapter of Genesis and still didn't finish. On this path is Rabbi Sadia Gaon, who on his explanation of Genesis 1:14 brought in external ideas. One who wants to learn external wisdom should read the books of the men of understanding.
So there's the truth. The truth is a point. This is not on the point. it's circling the point, but it's not actually hitting the point. To him, these are these people who will use the Torah as a vehicle for teaching philosophy. That's great and that's wonderful, and it may actually all be true, but the Torah is the point, and they're just circling around it. They're not on the point. They may be teaching true things, but if you want to learn philosophy, go read a philosophy book. If you want to learn Torah, read the Torah. But the two are different. Don't start introducing philosophy. And it's interesting, he points out, I mean, he's somewhat mocking the idea of someone who wrote 2 whole books on the first chapter of Genesis. It was 2 books for the first chapter, and like he still didn't finish. He still has, imagine how much the second chapter, how many, another 5 books, 10, how long of it, you were talking about 300 books to explain the whole Torah. These are philosophic treatises that are long and wordy, and they may be very true, and they may be very beautiful, but that's philosophy. That's not Torah. So the one, they're great, they're circling around the truth, but they're not hitting the truth. And so that's not acceptable to Ibn Ezra for explaining a commentary on the Torah. Dot in the middle, circling around it. Thoughts, challenges, questions on that before we move on to the second approach that Ibn Ezra is going to reject.
I mean, I'm not used to seeing people diss Sadia Gaon.
Well, I don't know if he's not dissing him. He's just saying that listen, he's on the chart, but he's around the circle. He's just, you call it a philosophy book, and that's great. But yeah, I mean, we saw before when Ibn Ezra was writing about his letter to with the letter that he received from Shabbat. The Shabbat itself, the way he writes what the Shabbat told him was not to right. I'm trying to find where it says it's like, do not favor any person. Meaning you're fighting a battle of truth, and it doesn't matter if it's Rashi, it doesn't matter if it's Rashbam, it doesn't matter if it's Rav Sadi Gaon, it doesn't matter who the person is. You're fighting for truth, and you have to fight for truth no matter who you're going to upset. So he's acknowledging, I think, the fact that he's bucking the trend of speaking very respectfully. He still is going to speak respectfully, but he's rejecting the notion that just because someone who's really important said it, therefore it must be true. He's saying, no, the truth is the truth, regardless of who says it. And if you're a great rabbi, but you're wrong, you're wrong. Okay, second paragraph, approach number 2. Someone want to read that for us? The second way is chosen by the twisted ones. Okay, Mark.
The second way is chosen by the twisted ones, some of them Jews, that believe they are standing on the point itself, but they don't even know where it is. This is the method of the Sadducees.
And when he says Sadducees, he's all scholars and people who study Ibn Ezra. Sadducees here, they weren't Sadducees around anymore. These are Karaites. They rejected, like the Sadducees, although they're different groups, but as far as Ibn Ezra is concerned, he's grouping them together. They're people who rejected the rabbinic tradition. They believe they're standing on the truth, and they are nowhere, they're not on the chart at all. The first source, at least, were circling around the point. They believe they're on the point, and they are so far off, they're not even on the chart. They're off the chart. Keep going.
Everyone says whatever they want about the verses, and even when it comes to laws, for you will not find a single law explicated completely in the Torah. I can mention one obvious one, such as eating on Yom Kippur, or chametz on Pesach, or resting on the 7th day, sacrifices, sukkah, shofar. There's nowhere in the Torah the laws of the calendar and how months are established. All of these laws require traditional understanding.
And he says, look, we have a calendar filled with holidays, things that have to happen on certain days. If you eat chametz on Pesach, you get karet. If you eat on Yom Kippur, you get karet. If you fail to keep Shabbat, you could be killed. All these rules that relate to a calendar, yet nowhere does it establish for us how the calendar, all the laws, all these laws for Rosh Chodesh, how we establish Rosh Chodesh, when is Rosh Chodesh, how is Rosh Chodesh, that's nowhere in the Torah. All the laws require it. How could you force people to not have chametz on Pesach if you don't know when Pesach is. He says, so clearly there is a rabbinic tradition, and we have to have that rabbinic tradition, because without that rabbinic tradition, we can't have a calendar. And so even Ezra uses this as evidence. He gives this as it's a long paragraph, but he says it's clear there has to be a rabbinic tradition. There must be. We have too many problems. We can't understand the text if there's not a rabbinic explanation of it. And so there must be a rabbinic explanation. And therefore, the Karaites who reject it, they just say whatever they want, making things up about what they think the Torah means. They're way off the charts. They're wrong. There's no way they could be right. They're not on the point at all. They're nowhere near the point. Thoughts on this, about this second group, the Karaites who reject rabbinic interpretation? Everyone's good with it. Okay. No one here is a Karaite. Good.
This is also people that think that they just start with the Torah and they don't have to read anything else. You just read what's there.
Yeah.
Reading what's there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he thinks that those people, he's kol ish kirtzano yefresh hapsukim. They just say whatever they want. You just walk in with no background, no history, no nothing. Just walk in, just say, oh, this is what I think it means. He says, you're totally far off. What was I just about to say about the Karaites? I don't remember. But, okay.
Does this mean they take it very literal?
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll see. Yeah. Actually,
I think
we'll come back to that after the third point, but maybe. Yeah.
Karaites are not necessarily literalists. It's just that they reject rabbinic interpretation as being like guiding or controlling in any way.
Yeah. So let's read. I don't know, how busy are you at work? Matthew? Can you read the third group?
Sure.
Which I think in some levels is like a foil to this. They're both people who You want to read the third group?
Yeah, the third way is darkness, and that is outside of the circle. They believe that the Torah and laws are all metaphoric. I will not address them at length, for they are mistaken of heart. The one thing that they have correct is that anything, a big mitzvah or a small one, is weighted in heart, for a person has wisdom in his heart. And if reason cannot support a matter, or it is contradictory, then one should seek out what is hidden. For the Torah was not given to one without understanding. But anything that reason does not contradict, we will understand it as it is written. For example, circumcising flesh and the foreskin of the heart.
Right. So he's saying there's another group of people who are going to say everything is a metaphor. So it's not. You have the first group who are saying things may be little, not a little, but we're not going to bring any rabbinic interpretation. We're just going to accept it as we read it. This next group are people who are going to say everything is a metaphor. Nothing is as what it means. Everything represents something else. Everything is metaphor. And Ibn Ezra, what's interesting here is Ibn Ezra will weigh this and he'll say, look, there is value to this. There's value to saying, I'm not going to just accept what the Torah says. And we'll see in a little bit, I'm not even going to accept what the rabbis say the Torah says if it doesn't make sense. And the example that he gives is the Torah is talking about circumcising the foreskin of your heart. You're not going to take that literally. Maybe the Karaites also won't take that literally. And he's saying you have to not take that literally. You have to recognize there are some things in the Torah that are just metaphorical. Or there are some things in the Torah that are literal, and you have to accept it as that, but you don't always have to. And so he's saying he doesn't want to. If philosophers were a circle around the dot, the Karaites were off the chart. They're outside of the circle. So I guess they're somewhat closer to the dot. The Karaites were off the charts entirely. So these people who take the Torah all as metaphors, they're on the chart because they have some value to talk about thinking and reflecting and not just taking everything and accepting as it is, but wanting to think about it and challenge it in a way and say, could this mean what it says? Could it not mean what it says? That's a valuable skill and an important skill. And Ibn Ezra is going to employ that many times. But they're still not in the circle. They're nowhere. They're not into the dot. They're on the chart, but they're far. But at least they're on it. Any thoughts on this third approach? Most of the first approach, the Rasadio and these philosophic ones, these you'll find in rabbinic interpretation. Even Ezra might think, like when I say, I mean like medieval and later exegetes, you'll see things, even contemporary people all the time. I quoted Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik uses the Torah as a vehicle for teaching philosophy all the time, which even Ezra would say is that first group. The second and third group, you don't find much in traditional Jewish interpretation of the Torah because they recognize rabbinic tradition, and they also recognize that Torah, when a mitzvah says to do something, you do it. So you're not going to find much rabbinic writing in the categories 2 and 3. Category 4, though, is going to be the most, and this Ibn Ezra is going to point out. Someone want to read for us the fourth approach?
I can do it again if nobody wants.
Okay.
The fourth way is close to the point, and many chase after it. This is the way of the sages in the Greek and Edomite lands. They don't look to weigh the ideas, they just rely on the collections of midrashim like Lekach Tov and Orei Naim. And now that these books have been written, why should we write them again? Ultimately, there is no end to the amount of drash one can give.
Right, so he says, you have these, this is the most popular one. All the rabbis do this. They do midrashim. They come up with these ideas or they quote from earlier books. But if you're quoting from earlier books, why do you need to write it? It's already been written. You don't need to write it. And if you're coming up with new ideas, there's no end. You could just keep on writing and writing. You could give all these types of beautiful, wonderful things, but there's no end to it. It's very close to the point. It's teaching true values, true morals, true ethics. It's teaching great things. It's very, very close to the point. And most of the rabbis who are writing commentaries on the Torah are doing this. They're explaining the Torah. They're not just giving philosophic ideas. They're explaining the text. And they're bringing all these beautiful traditional midrashim, all these wonderful things, but they're not on the point. And even as it says, that's great and that's wonderful. There's no real need for them, though, because people have been writing these for centuries. We don't need any more of them. You don't need to start. The fact that Rashi, you look in a good edition of publication of Rashi, every comment of Rashi, it'll footnote and say Rashi's quoting from this passage of the Talmud. Rashi's quoting from this midrash, that midrash, this midrash. Very rarely will Rashi, or I'll say most often, Rashi is picking from different midrashim. Now we talked 2 weeks ago about how he chooses midrash and which midrash he teaches. Even Ezra thinks that Rashi's he's just gathering, who cares? Who cares? He quotes this midrash or that midrash. It's still midrash. It's already been written. No one needs that. Yeah. So he's going to have his new approach. And this is the fifth source. Not the fifth source, the fifth paragraph here.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So where do you think Ibn Ezra would group Maimonides in his Guide to the Perplexed?
So it's interesting. I mean, it's worth noting, Maimonides never wrote a formal commentary to the Torah. And there's actually a significant amount of debate as to if Maimonides were to have written a commentary to the Torah, where he would fall out. I took a class in Bernard Revel, while he was graduate school of Jewish Studies, called Maimonides as a Biblical Exegete by Mordechai Cohen. He wrote a book called Opening the Gates of Interpretation, if anyone's looking for a thick book to read. So in it, he comes up with a whole concept of what he believes, what Maimonides believes, what a commentary on the Torah written by Maimonides would look like. And it actually, a lot of the concepts that Maimonides seems to subscribe to are similar, with some significant differences, but it's very similar to Ibn Ezra. So I think he would probably fall in, I'm not sure what Ibn Ezra would say about Maimonides, but I think contemporary scholars will put Rambam not too far away from where Ibn Ezra stands. But Maimonides was a halachicist. He wrote halacha. He didn't write a commentary to the Torah. So the Moreh Nevuchim is this big, beautiful philosophic work, but he writes that as a work of philosophy. He doesn't write that as a biblical commentary. And Ibn Ezra was annoyed by people who wrote philosophic works claiming they're biblical commentaries. He says, that's not a biblical commentary. That's a work of philosophy. So Moreh Nevuchim is a beautiful work of philosophy, and it'll quote and it'll bring supports from the Torah, but he would never call that a commentary on the Torah. He'd call that a work of philosophy and supporting his philosophic ideas in the Torah.
Except that I think part of the point was that the halacha is for the general community, and there are those people for whom that doesn't sit exactly right, and then there's another way of looking through, what do you say, a filigree to the core of things. So, yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, I mean, so Maimonides is a complicated individual, and what his full beliefs are tough to pin down sometimes. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I don't know. I'll see if Rabbi Dr. Mordechai Cohen wants to give a guest class after we finish Ramban, giving a survey of Maimonides. I can pull out my notes. We can just read my notes from the class, but I don't know. I'm sure he would actually be into that. It's good. I'll see if he can spend an hour. I mean, it's a thick, several hundred page book, but if you can reduce it down to an hour, maybe we'll do that after we do Ramban, first week in July.
Did I miss it? Was there support for the people saying that is needed for a rabbinic explanation through the Torah? Did the Torah support that, or did I miss that? Was that explained already?
So Ibn Ezra thinks rabbinic interpretation is great and it's important and it's wonderful, but it's not what as far as narrative passages, he's just not interested in it. It's great. The dot is here, the truth is here, and they're right here. Like, they're very close, but he's just not interested in it. We'll see when it comes to halacha, and then we'll see a couple of them in action. When it comes to halacha, as we saw from his treatment of Rashbam, when it comes to Jewish law, the rabbis are the point. They're the truth. And so you can't have close to the truth. When it comes to Jewish law, what the rabbis say is right, period. And that'll lead us to the fifth approach, which is Ibn Ezra's approach. So I'm going to read for us this last paragraph. The fifth way, this is the basis on which I write before God.
I can do it again.
Please.
The fifth way, this is the basis on which I write before God. Only him I will fear, and I won't favor anyone in Torah. I will search well the explanation of every
word.
Every word with all my strength, and I will explain to my best ability every word in the first place you find it. Like the word heavens will be found on verse 2.
That should really be verse 1, but yeah, okay.
I will not give explanations for the Masoret, why one word is written with a letter or without it, for all those explanations are drash. Because the truth is that sometimes it is written in long form and sometimes in short form. And the drash never pushes away the pshat, for there are 70 faces to the Torah. Just when it comes to the laws, if we find two explanations for the first, one is like
for the verse.
Sorry.
Okay.
If we find two explanations for the verse, one is like sages who are all righteous, we will rely on the without concern.
We will rely on them without concern. Okay.
We will rely on them without concern. God forbid that we mix with the Sadducees who say that the sages contradict the text and its explanation. Rather, our predecessors were true, and all their words are true, and the true Lord God should guide his servant on the way of truth. Okay,
so he brings up a couple different ideas here. One, he brings up the fact that he's going to care a lot about grammar and Duke, and he's going to spend a lot of time trying to understand the proper explanation of every word. And he's going to give you, and he's going to tell you the first place you see that word, he's going to give you a good explanation of what the word means, how it's used, when it's used. He's going to do that in a very grammatical way to be very careful and precise with the language. Number two, he's not going to be concerned when spelling of words have no grammatical implications. For instance, you can think of a word like the name Aharon. So Aaron's name, Aleph, Hey, Resh, Nun, Sofit. Most of the times it's Aleph, Hey, Resh, Nun. Sometimes there's a vav, sometimes there's not a vav. Is it Aharon called Maleh with a vav? Is it Chaser without a vav? He says that's not a significant grammatical point. That happens sometimes. He's going to write about grammar when it's relevant. That he's going to say it's not worth it. That's Drosh. Drosh is going to learn out every single letter is this way, that way. There's a yud, there's not a yud, it's this, that. That's Drosh. I'm not worried about that, Ramban. Ibn Ezra says, I'm worried about what the text says, the grammar of the text. I'm not going to worry about those things. And he'll say, additionally, Pshat is always there. Even the rabbis themselves who were very into Drosh said that Drosh does not push away Pshat. And so I'm going to address Pshat. But, he says, when it comes to laws, if we find two explanations of the verse, this is bringing up from, like we saw with Rashbam, he says, if there's the Pshat, so to speak, and there's the rabbinic interpretation that talks about law, he's going to choose the law 100% of the time. And he says, you can't start playing this game of there might be Pshat and it's different than the law, because that's just opening the door to and giving ground to the Sadducees. And so we're not doing that. We can't do that. We can't give them anything to stand on. That's not true. We've already established there have to be rabbinic interpretations. And to say that there could be an interpretation that wasn't rabbinic but still is true, he says that's unacceptable. And so he rejects that. He did acknowledge above in the third approach that there are sometimes that you have to read metaphorically, but those are going to be rare. And he's going to choose not to read metaphorically unless rationality requires reading metaphorically. And this is, and he ends off beautifully. May the God of truth help his servant himself write with truth. A very beautiful thing. And that's the last line of his introduction. Then he jumps into Bereshit, the creation of the world. Any thoughts on this last piece of Ibn Ezra, or any of the approaches? Any of the dots and the circles or charts, whatever. Anyone have any questions on that? Before we look at a couple different examples in the next couple minutes, just different examples of Ibn Ezra accepting or rejecting rabbinic interpretation, and sort of seeing all this in action.
I just want to point out that, he's largely relying on Muslim science. And I think that's one of the things that needs to be, we should remember about him, is that he was one of the major conduits for translation of Judeo-Arabic texts into Hebrew. A lot of what he wrote, a lot of what he published or wrote were translations actually of Judeo-Arabic. So just want to.
Thank you. He's I'm skipping a lot of the biographical stuff. Yeah, I mean he was a big scientist. He's one of 3 medieval rabbis who have a crater on the moon named after them. So they don't name craters on the moon after anyone. They name them after people who were significant.
There's a crater in the moon named after Ibn Ezra. Oops.
Yeah. So.
Sorry.
Yeah. So there you go. So he was outside of Jewish circles. He was significant. Ibn Ezra's one. The Ralbag is another one. And I think there's a third one. I don't know who the third one is. I think there's a third one, but Ralbag is definitely one, and Ibn Ezra's one. In case you were curious, I don't know where it's located. So you're gonna ask me where in the moon? Yeah.
It also strikes me that in his rejection of these various methods, there's a lot of sociology and politics, it seems to me, in the way he chooses his methodology, because it seems like the rejection of these other methods, while recognizing that those methods have some value in some sense, you don't want too much of that to intrude on the culture, on Jewish culture. And so it seems like he's kind of saying, yeah, it's sure, yeah, philosophy, very great, but that's not what we're about. So I think it's interesting to me because these sort of putatively just intellectual decisions about how you approach these things seem to have a lot of political and social implications.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it has a lot to do with I'm sorry, I got distracted here. Yeah, crater Ibn Ezra on the moon was named after Ibn Ezra. That's thank you for. I can show you guys a picture of it if you want. It's on Wikipedia. That its diameter is several. I don't know. I don't know how satellite craters work, but 23 kilometers, 44 kilometers. I don't know, but it's a big crater. So thank you, Mark, for sharing that. Yeah, but yeah, no, I think you're right, Bob. I think that there's you have to fully appreciate, and it's probably true for any of these people that we've studied, and to really appreciate what they're saying and why they're saying it. It's important to understand the sort of the social, the context in which they're writing, to realize that right, there was a lot of philosophy floating around, and Ibn Ezra wanted to make sure that that interpretation of the Torah maybe remained sort of pure and not, I don't want to say tainted, but to recognize the Torah is Torah, and it's not necessarily the same thing as philosophy. And philosophy is great and wonderful, but we don't want to necessarily blend them to the point where you can't tell which is which. And that there's definitely probably something that's going on in his head also as you're writing. So thank you for pointing that out. Any other thoughts before we look at some examples here?
Has rabbinic interpretation always been present since the Torah was given, or how did they rely upon understanding it when the first Israelites?
That's a weighty question. We'll say, I mean, I don't know how to best answer that question. So I'm going to answer that as far as Ibn Ezra is concerned, that rabbinic interpretation existed always. When the written Torah was given, there was the oral tradition with it. What that looks like is very debated and very it's a major subject. We talked about Maimonides. There's major debates over what exactly Maimonides believed about what was what and when and how and why. So that's like the answer that I'm going to give for you right now is according to Ibn Ezra, those rabbinic interpretations were handed down to Moses at Mount Sinai. With the written Torah, there were the oral traditions. What exactly those oral traditions were, that's a whole separate debate. But at least as far as the calendar, the setting of the calendar, to use an example that he already addressed, that he believes is just as divine as the written Torah. It was handed over orally, not written. Why? Conversation for another time. But you should know that topic itself is a big one as to what exactly of the oral Torah, what is the oral Torah and where does the oral Torah come from and when did we get it is subject to major debate, like everything else in Judaism. Sorry for a non-answer answer.
I just want to mention also that, I mean, again, it's debatable, but Spinoza in his critique of biblical authorship and relies on Ibn Ezra, his proofs of trying to show that it wasn't given at Sinai, or it wasn't all given at Sinai to Moses.
Yeah, so we'll touch on that, and some of the we'll come to that later on in this sheet if we hopefully we'll get to it. But yeah, so we'll touch a little bit about that. I mean, not on Spinoza, but about these ideas of Ibn Ezra that Spinoza definitely picked up on. Okay, so example from Halacha. So we saw from Rashbam last week. We talked to the tefillin. We started with that. We talked about it last week. That Rashbam observes that the Torah says you shall put it on a sign on your arm and on your forehead. And Rashbam said, okay, according to the Pshat, that means you should always remember it. So Ibn Ezra calls that out. Says this in source number 3, there are those who dispute our holy ancestors, and they say that it means to be a sign and a reminder, aka Rashbam says that this is not literal. However, this is an incorrect approach, for at the beginning of the book of Proverbs, it states the Proverbs of Solomon. Behold, everything mentioned in the book is a proverb. It should be proverb. But the Torah doesn't say that it is a proverb, God forbid. It is as it is, and we will not remove it from its pshat. He says, look, sometimes the Bible talks in metaphors. And you know when it talks in metaphors? It will often say, this is a metaphor. There's a whole book of the Bible that says, these are proverbs. Nowhere in the Torah does it say that these are proverbs. So why would we read this metaphorically? It's literal. It is as it is, and we will not remove it from the pshat, for its literal meaning does not contradict any logical principle, as is the case for you shall circumcise the foreskin of your heart, the understanding of which needs to be adjusted. And so he says that, look, it's when the text can't be understood as it is, okay, so then you have to use metaphor. Tefillin is not one. It may be annoying putting black boxes on your arm and on your head, but it's not hard to understand. It's not irrational. It's not like circumcising the foreskin of your heart. It's something you might think is weird, but you still have to do it. That's how Ibn Ezra understands tefillin. And he calls out, he doesn't say Rashbam, but he calls out Rashbam's interpretation and says, this is unacceptable. And he brings the proof for it. He's not just going to say, this is what I believe, but he thinks, look, I can prove to you that you're wrong. Because the Torah, the Bible, when it's giving proverbs, says, behold, this is a proverb. But if it doesn't say, behold, this is a proverb, it's not a proverb, unless it can't be taken literally. That's an example of halacha we've seen already in our Shabbat. Here's tefillin also.
Is that similar to his point 3 above?
Yes.
Interpretations?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. If a reason contradicts the pshat, then you have to understand it differently. Reason contradicts circumcising the foreskin of your heart is actually meaning open heart surgery and cutting flesh away from the heart. That can't be. So that has to be metaphoric. But if it were understandable, then you'd have to accept it as it is. I'm going to skip the example against Midrash right now because I want to touch on the idea of Ibn Ezra's secrets. But I encourage you to read the example from source number 4, where he rejects a very popular rabbinic idea that about the age of Yocheved, Moshe's mother, when she was born, and he rejects it and thinks it's absolutely ludicrous, which I think is, again, so he doesn't have any issue with rabbinic interpretation. The rabbis, we can throw them out. They can say whatever they want to say. They can teach beautiful truths and moral ideas, whatever, but that's not the pshat of the Torah. And so he rejects this midrash there in source number 4. Source number 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. We're not going to have a lot of time to do this well right now, so I'll say the following. There are various places in Ibn Ezra's commentary where he doesn't say what he actually means. There's many times when Ibn Ezra will have these secrets. They're known as the secrets of Ibn Ezra. He won't say directly what he means. He'll just highlight an idea and sort of like Hamevin Yavin. One who understands will get it. Many people will read it, not understand it, and just move on. But Ibn Ezra believes that if you're smart enough, if you're smart as him, you'll understand what he's trying to communicate, and you'll also understand why he's not saying it explicitly. One example of that, and this is stuff that Spinoza, I think, picks up on. One example of that is post-Mosaic authorship of various parts of the Torah. The example that I'm going to have right here, although he hints to this in a couple different places, a few places, which I think is also a significant piece about post-Mosaic authorship, and that's a whole separate conversation. But he hints to, for instance, the very first line of the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, the Torah says, Elah hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael be'ever hayarden. These are the words that Moses addressed to all the people of Israel on the other side of the Jordan, through the wilderness, in Arabah, near Suf, etc., etc., etc. So Rashbam, we saw last week, here's how he understands this. He says, be'ever hayarden, on the other side of the Jordan. Be'eze ever hayarden, which side of the Jordan? He says in the desert, on the bank of the Jordan, facing the desert in which the Israelites had spent the last 40 years, which is known as the, quote, other side of the Jordan to the people in Israel, but not considered the other side of the Jordan to people who are next to Israel. For Israel is also called the other side of the Jordan for people in the desert, like where Israel was. Meaning, when the Torah says that this is the speech that Moses gave, it's giving it relative to the Jordan. Where are the people, where are they? They're on the side of the Jordan. If you were standing in Israel, you'd call they were standing on the other side of the Jordan. If you were standing outside of Israel, you'd say that they were on this side of the Jordan. But the term other side of the Jordan doesn't mean anything. Rashbam is saying that because there were people, like even Ezra will point out, who believe that, look, if we're reading the Torah, and the Torah says, this is what Moses said on the other side of the Jordan, that means where is the writer standing? On this side of the Jordan. They're standing on this side of the Jordan, and Moses said this on the other side of the Jordan. Right? So the pshat may be that this verse of the Torah is written and appears to an audience who is standing inside the land of Israel, because the speech that Moses gives is outside of the land of Israel. It's on the other side of the Jordan. So the Torah says, we're standing over here, and this is the speech that Moses gave on the other side of the Jordan, which is a problem because the Torah was given and written outside of the land of Israel. So why is it written from the perspective of inside the land of Israel, referring to a place on the other side of the Jordan, when the other side of the Jordan is not the other side of the Jordan? The other side of the Jordan should be this side of the Jordan. Right? So Rashbam says, it doesn't mean other side of the Jordan. It just means on the side of the Jordan. Depending on where you're standing, it could mean different things. If you're standing outside of the land of Israel, it's referring to here. If you're standing inside of the land of Israel, it's referring to there. The Torah was given outside of the land of Israel, so when it says on the other side of the Jordan, it means on the side of the Jordan, on this side of the Jordan, outside of the land of Israel. Is that clear to people? I'll say it again. The Torah says that Moses gave a speech on the other side of the Jordan. If you're standing in the land of Israel, then that makes perfect sense. You're standing in Jerusalem, let's say, and on the other side of the Jordan, in the plains of Moab, between Paran and Tophel and Lavan and Chatzerot, on the other side of the Jordan, that's where Moses gave his speech. And that makes wonderful sense. We're here in Israel, and Moses gave that speech on the other side of the Jordan. That's where he gave the speech, not here, there. The problem with that is that the first verse of the book of Devarim, if it was written by Moses, if it was given to Moses in the desert, then it wasn't given in the land of Israel. It was given outside of the land of Israel. So why would the Torah say on the other side of the Jordan when it's not the other side of the Jordan? It's on this side of the Jordan. This was in the desert, on this side of the Jordan. Does that make sense? A little clearer?
Rob Jared, is this like a geographical analog of the verse that refers to how the Canaanite was in the land in those days?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly.
Like a temporal version of the same problem.
Exactly. So we'll use that as a good example. The Torah in the book of Genesis describes how the Canaanites were then in the land of Israel. And so the pshat would mean they were then in the land of Israel as opposed to now, when now they are not in the land of Israel. Right? So there are verses like that one, the Canaanites were then in the land, and like this one, which seem to suggest that the writer of the Torah was writing in a time when the Canaanites were no longer in the land of Israel, and when the Israelites were in the land of Israel. Rashbam explicitly rejects that and thinks that the pshat doesn't mean that. The pshat means, at least for the two sides of the Jordan, I don't know what Rashbam says about the Canaanites then in the land as opposed to now. I don't know what he says, but Ibn Ezra makes his comment there. He's the same, he makes it here. And Ibn Ezra basically says, if you understand the secret of the 12, this is source number 7, if you understand the secret of the 12, and also Moses wrote, and the Canaanites were then in the land, and the mountain where God is seen, and behold, his bed is a bed of iron. It says, the secret to understanding this verse is the same as to understanding the thing about the Canaanites, and the same of all these other examples. He says, there's something going on here. And he says the secret of the 12. Ibn Ezra ends up giving it away what that secret of the 12 is. And source number 8, Ibn Ezra suggests that the last chapter of the Torah, the last 12 verses of the Torah, the last chapter of the Torah, which is 12 verses, those 12 were written by Joshua once they entered into the land of Israel. And Ibn Ezra says explicitly over here in source number 8 that that's post-Mosaic authorship. Moses didn't write those verses. Now, full disclosure, the rabbis of the Talmud even acknowledge that there's an opinion in the Talmud that says the last 8 verses of the Torah were not written by Moses. Ibn Ezra extends it another 4 verses and says not just the last 8 verses, but the last 12 verses. The entire last chapter of the Torah, Ibn Ezra suggests, was not written in the land of Israel. Was not written by Moses. It was written in the land of Israel, post-Moses. And Ibn Ezra here is suggesting that that's the case for all these other verses. Any verse in the Torah that appears to be anachronistic, that it's referring to a time or to a place which doesn't make sense in its context, Ibn Ezra says, those were all written by Joshua. Those were written later. This was picked up by Spinoza and others to be a major support and proof for biblical criticism, which if we were going to have a conversation with biblical criticism, it would take us another several hours to really go in depth into that area. But this is something I think is significant for Ibn Ezra, an example of his secrets, but also you can see why he doesn't want to say this explicitly, because he's acknowledging the fact that there are verses in the Torah that are not of Mosaic origin. He limits them maybe to Joshua, maybe even later than Joshua, but he's not talking huge chunks of the Torah by centuries or millennia later. He's referring to select verses being written a generation, maybe two, maybe a little longer than that. But this is a final idea of Ibn Ezra and his secrets. This is a complicated idea, and I sort of rushed this because I didn't want to take up too much time. I'm happy to continue talking about it more after, but I'll just end right now. Going back to that question, Ibn Ezra, does what the rabbis say ever matter? Unlike Rashbam, who basically said it doesn't really ever matter, Ibn Ezra is going back and saying, well, it does matter. When it comes to Jewish law, it does matter. But when we're not talking about Jewish law, it's really fair game. And you can say whatever you want. You can, not whatever you want, as long as it makes sense. But the rabbis don't have a monopoly on the quote unquote truth of the Torah. They do when it comes to halacha, when it comes to Jewish law. But aside from that, Ibn Ezra feels free, and he would probably encourage everyone else to feel free to using their understanding and their powers of logic and reasoning to come up with the best explanations that they can. Controversial character. He also wasn't a halachicist, which is going to, he wasn't a Talmudist, which sort of takes him down several pegs in the eyes of many, that he was a Bible guy, but he wasn't like a Talmud guy. And we'll see that may come up to sort of take away some of his credibility as a heavyweight thinker in Judaism if he has nothing to say on the large volumes of Talmud. According, in the eyes of Talmudists, they're going to sort of knock him down. But that's Ibn Ezra for us. Any other thoughts and questions on this before I stop the recording and we can continue having a conversation about this secret of Ibn Ezra for people who didn't understand it? All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming, for exploring Ibn Ezra with me. And we'll finish up next week with looking at Ramban, who has some choice words for Ibn Ezra. And maybe we'll see after that if I can get one final class guest taught on Maimonides. But we'll see about that. Oh, Marvin, do you have a question?
Nope.
Okay.
All
right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.